It is not uncommon here and there in informal gatherings for someone to say to me, "So why did you become a priest?" And I almost invariably answer, "That's not a very interesting question. The interesting question is why I stayed a priest." The stories about commitment are not the origin stories at the front end. That's also true about people that risk marriage. It isn't why did you get married, it's why did you stay married. There's where the stories are. Well, I want to talk about how Ignatius teaches in his method of prayer, the spiritual exercises. I want to lay out one of his core central teachings about how you need to pray. And I'm going to do it briefly because then I'm going to use that and apply it to us as a collective group. Ignatius teaches that for individuals. The teaching is, when you start to pray, try to know where you are rather than where you're not. And that's a fairly simple discipline. I'll bet you everyone in this room has had the experience at some point or another, probably in the workplace, where someone will say, "Look out for so-and-so today, he's in a really pissy mood." But he doesn't know he's in a pissy mood. You know what you mean? You don't know where you are? Well, Ignatius says, when you start to pray, like I'm making a retreat, I've directed lots of people in 8-day retreats or 30-day retreats. When you begin, I try to invite them to try to be surprisable about what will happen when they have some time, when they're not pushing their agendas, their commitments. And what has often been my experience is someone will come in and they'll say, "I'm a mess. My life is completely disconnected. I'm bitter and cynical and I'm embarrassed, blah, blah, blah." And about 2 days later, they say, "This is very confusing. I keep finding I'm happy. I really didn't expect this." That's the sort of thing when you help someone make a retreat where you say, try to be surprisable about where you actually are. I've also had people that have come in full of generous purpose and plans, and there was someone who told me she was going to finish her dissertation, get married, and go in the job market, and that's what this retreat was going to be about. And a day and a half later, she came in, her eyes were puffy, she was exhausted, she was angry. She said, "I cried all night long." And then she ranted for a while and said, "I did this already. I buried my father 2 years ago, that's done. I have to start my life." She was a very honest woman, and as she ranted, I said, "It doesn't sound like that's done yet, does it?" And she was terrifically honest, a lovely human being. And so she said, "No, it's not done." And so for about 5 straight days, she plunged into the depth of grief and loss and anger that had been shaking her to the heart of her being because it wasn't finished. And she couldn't start the next phase of her life yet. So Ignatius says, whether you're just doing an ordinary prayer once a day just to recollect yourself, or you're investing some serious time for a retreat or something, ask for the grace to recognize where you are and to pray from where you are, not from where you're not. Now, that's a principle that Ignatius teaches that is right at the center of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. I want to apply it to, this is a little bit of a creative fiction. I want to assume that the people in this room are a collective, and that probably all of us are in that part of the population of the United States that has access to higher education. So that's one type of elites in the United States, a privilege to have higher education. So we imagine if the teaching about St. Ignatius, try to pray from where you are rather than where you're not. Beware of nostalgia, in other words. I want to apply it to us as a group. And I want to talk about 2 kinds of nostalgia. The first kind of nostalgia, they're both, the way I understand nostalgia, it means when your memory gets distracted and loses its way, you're suffering from nostalgia. When your memory gets distracted and loses its way, that's nostalgia. And I'm going to talk about two historical periods in this country that are both nostalgic, but one of them is fear and anger distracting your memory, and the other one is triumphant exuberance distracting your memory. The effect, when I use the word nostalgia, I mean that when your memory is distracted by dreams of fear and anger or dreams of triumph and grandeur, then you're not able to notice where you are. You're not able to pay attention to where you are now. So 3 parts. One, an example that I think works in our imaginations as fear and anger. One that is triumphant. And then I want to say a little bit about what are some of the challenges of trying to pray now in the 21st century. The fear and anger one is the 5 years after World War I. I've taken some comfort as a historian in using those 5 years of American history, 1920 to 24 really, as a template for understanding what's going on in this country politically right now. This is not the first time that this country has suffered the anger and the fear and the mutual suspicion and all the things that are roiling us at the moment. After World War I, in 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 basically destroyed the Statue of Liberty promise, which was, we welcome people from all over the world. There was a powerful period from roughly 1880 to 1914 when immigrants were coming into this country from many parts of the world. And it was the glory of this country was all the different cultures and languages and traditions that were coming into this world. But in 1924, the federal government created a new law that restricted immigrants to any given national group to 2% of what their percentage of people in the U.S. was in 1890. And that meant for most of the Eastern and Southern Europeans that came in to work in the factories, and most of the Chinese that came in to work in the factories in the West, a lot of them came in after 1880. So 1880 said, there aren't going to be many people we're letting in. And basically, you couldn't get into the United States as an immigrant after 1924 unless you were from the northern tier of Europe. So Scandinavia, Netherlands, England, France, Germany. And what was that about? Well, it was about a nation that was racked with fear of the people who were other, which is what the fear of immigration has been each time it is heated up in this country. 1844, 1877, 1893, 1924, and now. Those are the times when, if you look historically, there's a terrible problem with what do you do with people that aren't like you. So that's one thing that is going on in that time. A second thing, in 1924 again, politically, the Democratic Party was divided between two equally powerful groups. So powerful that it took 103 ballots to elect the candidate. They were having fistfights in the hall. There's an anecdote about some guy when people were shouting and screaming at each other in the hall, came in with 2 handfuls of live chickens, holding them by their feet, and throw them out there into the people were crazy. 103 ballots before they elected someone. What were those two groups? that were so equally matched in power and influence that they could not come to terms with each other. One were the Tammany Hall Irish Catholics, who were running most of the Northeast cities, and the other one was the Ku Klux Klan. They were about evenly powerful. Now, we've never in our lifetime seen political turbulence where people have trouble getting along and agreeing with each other, but but I wanted to recall to your memory that it is helpful to remember that this is not the first time that some things happen. The last thing that is another, well, there's a few last things, but 1924 is also the year that more black men were lynched than any other year in our history. It was a mean, violent, nasty time. Why do you suppose it was so mean and so violent? Partly it has to be that there was a long time without a world war or anything like it. And when World War I came along, it took the elites of the world by surprise. The second thing is that the chemical warfare weaponry that was designed during World War I it's not for nothing that it has been outlawed, even though it's back. Chemical weapons took people that were functioning biological adults, and you watched them disintegrate biologically in front of your eyes. You watched them lose the faculty to breathe, to swallow. And that's just a horrible, unnatural thing. And another tough thing is that not everybody died. A lot of people landed in hospitals, and the streets of pretty much every city in Europe and every city in the United States, you had people who were horribly maimed walking around, barely functional, and they didn't get better. That's a deeply frightening sight, to see that many people. And these were people that might have been your neighbors, you know? Nice 18-year-old kid. And now he's ruined. His body is destroyed and his biological functions, they keep him alive, but not a lot else. How much fear is there when you had gotten used to a period of international tranquility for 30, 40, 50 years, and this horror descends upon you? You can throw in the fact that the Soviets took over Russia. That was a pretty scary thing. The Red Scare of 1919 was pretty frightening. So this was a frightening time, and because it was so frightening, a lot of things in the culture got very mean. The meanness, probably, you could say, distracted the memories of many people living at that time. They were so distracted by the horrors and the discouragement that they saw that they didn't know how to, you might say, obey Ignatius's teaching. Try to pray from your memory. Try to remember the things in your life that want your attention. Try to notice the things in your life that are worth your attention. You can't notice everything. If you try to notice everything, they'll put you in an asylum. So Ignatius says, try to notice some, this is his words, some more important places in which I have experienced understanding or consolation or desolation. Try to use your memory to tell you where you are. So that's the first, I'll call that period a high watermark of nostalgia as terror and distracting fear. And we are fairly close to that right now. This is a disturbed and turbulent time in the country. Not quite as bad as then, I don't think, but pretty bad. We haven't seen it in my lifetime. The level of venom that is slung back and forth across people who differ with each other. Second, nostalgia. Excuse me. Again, I'm talking about nostalgia as a distraction from remembering in a way that will help you know where you are in your life and in the world. And that's World War II. World War II is the only successful war in U.S. history, if by successful you mean it had the support of the great majority of American people who were willing to change their lifestyles because of the goodness of that war. It was successful probably because we had the luxury of having enemies that lived up to the war hype. No other war we've had in our history have our enemies been so cooperatively horrible. So Hitler and the death camps mean when you have the luxury, you're in a war, and your enemies cooperate by being truly evil. That's a heady brew. You can get an attitude about yourselves if you're fighting against people that cooperate with you by being monstrous. That war ended with us winning it. We reluctantly went into it. We won because our technological creativity and our scientific creativity and our coming together as a people, that's why we won that war. And it was a knockout. I mean, it's a legitimately astonishing war victory. About 95% of the population of the country at the time supported that war. Revolutionary War, maybe 40% of the population supported that war. The Civil War, by definition, half the people in the country didn't support your war. World War I, that's when the Anti-Sedition Act came in. Suspicion of the enemies. There was a crime to make fun of the flag, all that kind of stuff. That all came in during World War I. World War II is the exception. I mean, it's amazing that there was a time when the expression "we the people" actually meant a lot to almost everybody. So when you fighting really bad guys, the evil enemy is out there, and you have a lot of sacrifice going on for honorable reasons in your own country. And you started off way behind your enemies technologically and militarily, and by the third year of the U.S. involvement in the war, we were overwhelming our enemies with, especially this city, the arsenal of democracy was here, with our ability to design and then mass produce an immense array of weapons that simply overwhelmed the Germans and the Japanese. So when I was a little kid, I was 5 when the war ended. And you know how little kids get ideas in their heads and they don't exactly know that they're crazy? They don't even know that they're crazy and they don't ask about it. They're kind of in their head. Well, mine was that Stalin was Hitler's son. Well, I mean, Hitler was gone, and a new guy stepped right into the role. He was the world leader. He was as bad as Hitler. His violence to his own people was 20 million Russians were killed by Stalin, something like that. So, as a little kid, what do you know when you're 5 years old? Not much. But I had this in my head that there was a guy named Hitler who was really bad, and then he goes away, and then there's a guy who's doing the exact same job in the world, and he takes right up without hitch. The reason I mention that is it is a cute kid story, but the main reason I mention it is the Cold War started with us believing that we were an honorable defender of the rights of human beings all over the world, but that we were also the absolute breakthrough leaders in technological innovation and in scientific breakthroughs. And we cared about the people that we defeated. The Marshall Plan, we say, we rebuilt Europe, and we rebuilt Japan too. So those two enemies, we didn't leave them smoldering in ruins. So we were an honorable people who had the convenience of a world power that was duking it out with us. That would be the Russians, the Soviet Union. what does it do to us? I'm talking about us as a collective group of people that have the access to higher education. What does it do to your memory if you have this dazzling golden period? And then, I guess we better add on to the dazzling golden period. After we win, the U.S. government was very alarmed in 1944 because there were 16 million men and women in uniform. And a lot of them were going to be demobilized after the war is over. Every single war in our history, about 2 years after the end of a war, you had riots, pitched battles in the street because of veterans who couldn't get jobs after having sacrificed like that. So social turmoil followed every single war. Well, we never had 16 million people in uniform before. What are we going to do so that we don't blow up? And they did two very smart things. One, the GI Bill. The GI Bill said, you have sacrificed so much that we will pay your college tuition. This is when an awful lot of kids whose parents were factory workers, who wouldn't dream of getting to college, got to college. That's when all the Jesuit schools began to get big. You had thousands of people. It also disrupted the Jesuit schools, by the way. They were being run as pious kind of seminaries until the GI Bill came along, and there was a correspondence between the president of St. Louis University, Paul Reinert, and the president of Notre Dame, a good friend of his, Ted Hesburgh. And one of them, I can't remember which one said it to the other, but said, you know, our student body now is not buying what we're selling. They've seen the world. They are not interested in catechism. We have to learn to change our way of educating because our student body is changing it for us. And gradually we did, of course. So, do you think that the wars since World War II are like World War II? Vietnam? All those little wars when we were trying to, Grenada and places like that, where we were trying to find enemies we could fight after the defeat of Vietnam. Since the Sioux beat the U.S. Army in 1868, the first time the U.S. military was soundly defeated was Vietnam. Shown on television. Many of us remember those last televised days of getting the last people you could out of Saigon. People were grabbing onto the bottoms of the departing helicopters trying to get out of that city. That was an enormous humiliation for the United States. And it happened, by the way, to be in the 70s when you had the first oil crisis. In 1901, petroleum was 5 cents a barrel, cheaper than water. By 1972, when OPEC organized itself, we were in lines waiting at the gas pump. The price of oil had gone up by 40%, 50%. By the way, that also meant that the Soviet Union, which has a lot of oil and petroleum assets, was able to compete with us in the Cold War because they had so much money they were making from their petroleum sales. That's why they could confront us for 45 years in the Cold War. They had the money. Now, nothing else happened in the 70s that would bother us, I'm sure. Well, there was Watergate, which people are talking about right now. I was hearing some radio program about comparing what's going on in the White House right now with what was going on in Nixon's White House in '74. So that was happening. It was just a terrifying time for us. And about the middle of the 70s, we began to realize that the Germans and the Japanese, whom we had bombed to smithereens, had rebuilt their industrial base, and they were making better stuff than we were. Do you remember when you began to figure out that U.S. stoves weren't as good as Japanese ones, or TVs weren't as good, or cars weren't as... That's right in the middle of the 70s. The 70s were a tremendously demoralizing time in this country. I think I would suggest, in terms of prayer, that we need to look at the world we're living in now, and we need to allow ourselves to love the world the way it is, and try not to be distracted by good old days stuff. How many people do you think spend some of their time each week watching a World War II movie? A lot of people. How many are watching Vietnam movies? Not very many. So we are in a time, I think, and that's kind of the point of this talk, where the teaching of Ignatius is very helpful to us, but it's very challenging to us. Try to pray from where you are rather than from where you're not. When my grandfather started selling Model Ts in 1912, he was the first Ford dealer in his part of the state of Wisconsin. If you asked him, what was he doing with his talents and his life, what was he doing that was worthwhile, he would passionately tell you, I help people to be able to move around away from the railroads. I am helping people on farms. I'm helping people do something they've never had before, which is durable automobile transportation. It was a dream. There were people at the same time who would answer that same question. We're working on building this hospital, and when the hospital is done, we'll have a hospital. And other people were saying, we're going to build a bridge across this river, and when we've built the bridge, we will have helped our part of the country. That kind of delight in saying, we work hard, we are talented, and we have a good system of allowing people and companies to be creative. Is that what young adults think now? I think right now, young adults, and this is fairly new, the last 30 years probably, is it the same dream that my grandfather had when he, as a young guy, imagined, I think I'm smart enough to start a car dealership. I think I can make this work. And it was exciting, It said, I'm changing the landscape of the way people travel. A lot of young people today are saying, well, the place is a mess. The pollution is awful. The media are falling apart. It's hard to get a decent job. Intimacy is pretty hard on a lot of people. I just heard that the number of people living alone, single adults living not with a family, that was 21% back about 20 years ago. It's 50% now. So how do young people right now learn to pray so that the world that they are living in is beautiful and beloved of God and is a source of creativity, that you can risk it. You can risk loving the world the way it is. Nostalgia says, use tricks of memory to pretend the world isn't where it is. And that's tough. And it's tough right now to love the world the way it is. I'm finding it tough. I don't know about you. There are lots of different things that are ominous as can be. And that's probably when the teachings of Ignatius about prayer are the most valuable and the most important. I've directed, as I say, lots of people, and what I find is whether they start out a train wreck and don't know it, like that woman who lost her father. She made a wonderful retreat, by the way, and at the end of it, when she had found her way into joy in the midst of loss, which she had to get to, it took her 5 days. The last day, she had a day, she started praying about getting married, finishing her dissertation, and going on the job market. She did all three. She's doing fine, got kids, living a lovely life. But there was a harrowing moment there when she was making that retreat where she had to risk noticing where she was and try to avoid nostalgia. which is just a distraction, saying I don't want to be where I am, so I'm not there. I think the reason I thought this would be a good talk for our group is all of us are risking loving this world. All of us are risking loving flawed people that are beloved to us. All of us have bad days when we feel worn down and discouraged. We are tempted to nostalgia. I think that's true. But God is not tired of us. This is no worse, our time right now, than 1955, when the economic boom after World War II meant that families were getting homes and new cars and all that stuff. Don't you think sometimes you kind of hanker after a time like that? Say, geez, it'd be nice to be back there. That's a distraction. We are invited by the teachings of prayer of St. Ignatius to try to ask for the grace to be at home in and to love the world the way it is now. That world. I started this thing by saying, every now and then someone says, why did you become a Jesuit? And I said, it's not that interesting a question. The interesting question is why I stayed a Jesuit. Then I usually go along with that. I say that life on the Indian reservation, coming to Detroit, and the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, those are the loves of my life. That's why I did it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Father Staudenmaier. Father Staudenmaier is very anxious to do some question and answers from the audience. So we have Mary Alice O'Brien Meckie with a microphone. There she is. And by the way, there is a plate of cookies on everybody's table. So make sure you pass those around. And at my table, please make sure my wife puts one on my plate, because I know she won't. I'll start with the first question. I was watching a John Wayne movie last night, Sons of Katie Elder, and I really felt good watching that movie. Should I worry about that?
I think when is entertainment, and when does it become nostalgia? That's a very important question. If you're watching John Wayne 3 times a week, you got some troubles. But Ignatius says, pay attention to what disturbs you and trust what you're noticing. And like I am a big fan of the Brother Cadfael mystery novels. And I know them all by heart, and I use them with an audiobook as a sleeping pill because I know what the story is, and I like the cadence of of what's going on. Now he's a 11th century Benedictine monk in Wales. And you say, John, are you nuts? Are you living in the 11th century? Are you hung up on a Benedictine monk? I say, no, but it helps me. So this is not to say that everything that you read or watch on media ought to be like taking an exam. But it does mean notice what you don't want to know about and ask for the grace to let God give you the suppleness and the courage to pay attention to the things you don't want to know about. Question?
Father, my question is, when you mention or you say that we should love the world we're in and use that as maybe a base for our prayers or our thoughts, when we're inundated, as everybody in here knows, every day with communication and some of the horrors in the world, how do you disassociate yourself from that to put yourself in a position that you were mentioning?
The teaching in the Catholic Church theologically is, how does God approach the human condition, meaning the entire human condition, leaving nothing out? Does God approach it from a starting point of suspicion or a starting point of affection? And the Catholic teaching for 2,000 years has been, God approaches the whole of reality from a starting point of affection. And you try then to heal the wounds of the world from a starting point of affection. The alternative theology is to say, God looks for the bad stuff and tries to laser it out so that the bad stuff disappears and doesn't exist, and then you can live a decent life, you know. That's not Catholic theology. But does it mean that you don't notice that some of the world frightens us, wounds us, wears us down? No. It is saying, does God love the world we live in or not? And that's a theological point which is very powerful. And on good days, I'm pretty good at it. And on bad days, I want to go out with a high-powered taser and take them out, whoever them are. So I don't say this is easy. I am saying it is the ideal at the heart of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, and it is actually at the heart of Roman Catholic theology. When I do this, we do half-day mission retreats at the university for faculty and staff and administrators, and I teach this about the teaching that God loves the world the way it is, leaving nothing out. And I say, well, what happens then at the end of every semester when the associate dean of each college sends out letters after exams are in announcing you're on probation or announcing that you're dismissed from the school for academic reasons? Those come out every single semester. What do you do with that if you say God loves the world the way it is? Well, that doesn't mean you don't love the world by lying to people. And if you have students that cannot do what they need to do, then you need to tell them that. And that means it's dismissal. But kids that are hard to teach are hard to teach. And it is not unusual for somebody to be dismissed for academic reasons. For people to go back to about the year 1890, when you began to have water systems in U.S. cities that allowed plumbing indoors, which meant you could have toilets so that you no longer had such vivid evidence of where your shit went. It was in a hole in the backyard. And now, all of a sudden, you go, boom, and it disappears. Well, what I say to people that work at our university, I say, yes, we have to maintain standards. Yes, we have to flunk people out when we must flunk them out. But when we do, what are we doing to grieve our loss and not succeeding with that person? But the temptation on a bad day, this is not easy stuff. The temptation on a bad day is to imagine that toilet and just say, that kid's not going to bother us anymore. That's a temptation. And to recognize that it is a temptation, that the calling of God is to love the whole world, that's the calling of our university. It better be. But on good days, we do it more generously and more playfully than in bad days. Floor is open.
I just wanted to say, you can look at the world and see today when you watch TV and all the bad. And you can concentrate on all the bad. But I have said, if I had picked any time in history to live, it would be today. I live in Troy, and we have a mixed neighborhood. There are blacks, there are Chinese, there are Japanese. When I lived in Detroit in the 50s and 60s, it was segregated. I go to Myers and I see the disabled. I go to Kroger. They were in closets in my time. I never saw them.
That's right.
Today, women have, we had a black president. We have women that can do anything. At one time, they couldn't vote. I mean, on and on and on. I can see all the bad, but boy, I love today.
Thank you. I try most mornings when I wake up to notice what mood I'm in. That's a very Ignatian thing. And on bad days, I say, look out, John. You're going to be whacking people over the head or something because you're in a bad state. You got to pay attention to your inner state. It is not easy to love the world. Would you grant me that? So it is not easy every day to find your way into the joy of your life. So when you notice that you're not there, then you can have the sense to ask for the grace to find the joy of your life again. But if you don't notice it, and you're walking around banging into walls and smacking people and don't even know that, I don't know that you ever notice road rage, but I have occasionally encountered road rage. And you want to say, oh, wonder who that person's married to. This must be a hell of a day. So this teaching is not that you achieve a perfect level of serenity. The teaching is you need to learn when to notice that you need the grace of God because you're in a tough spot.
One more question.
Father, I'm kind of aware, I'm really aware, of the power of wealth in our country right now. People talk about the Congress, nobody there is poor or even middle class. They're all millionaires and billionaires. The people who are in the most responsible positions in our politics right now are very wealthy. The stock market kind of rules the world, literally around the world. Could you put that fact into the synthesis that you're giving us?
I'll give it a try. Every time in every culture, anywhere in the world, at any time, this is my own way of thinking, is no further away from the grace of God than any other time. But the temptations are different at different times. And certainly the distribution of wealth is something that is very troubling in this country. There's a guy named Myron Orfield who has made, he lives in Minneapolis. He has studied metropolitan areas, many of them, 70 of them. He studied ours, cost us about $50,000. He mapped out the whole metropolitan area, and so for us it'd be the 4 counties probably. He mapped out every district according to measures of wealth and poverty. So percentage of kids that get federally funded lunches, would be a marker and it'd be a certain color, like that. And he did about 35 measures of wealth and poverty and then did a complex analysis geographically of what that looks like. And what he says is in every single large metropolitan area in the country, approximately 70% of the population pays for the lifestyle of approximately 30%. Because the 30% are not burdened with the tax burdens of poor school systems and people that have drug addiction in high numbers and so on. And he said, if the 70%, he said, and I was surprised when he said, it comes out about 70-30, so that means that most of the suburbs are on the wrong side of the deal also. So what does it take to say zoning laws need to be addressed to spread out the wealth and spread out the poverty? That would do a lot of good. You remember that guy that was walking 21 miles a day to get to work? Very famous guy. Well, he was interviewed after, a lot of people, they did a crowdfunding for him, and somebody gave him a car and all that. And a week or two later, he was being interviewed, and he said, that's fine. I can use the money and I can use the car. But the most important thing that has happened because of the notoriety of this story about me is people are starting to talk about the bus system. The reason he had to walk 21 miles is because in our metropolitan area with approximately 110 governing units, some big, some little, 44 of them don't permit buses in their territory. That's why he couldn't take the bus to work. Well, it's hard. The people have a lot of hard, mean memories about being driven out of Detroit by fear and crime. And it's hard to say to them, we're all one city, not little bitty cities. It's hard to say we need a transit system that lets people of color go to places where there are jobs, because the jobs aren't where they are, although that's changing. Detroit is starting to come back, which is pretty thrilling to me. Nonetheless, that's kind of stuff none of this is easy, but what Ignatius says is whatever you are encountering, do your best to approach your world and yourself with reverent affection and a willingness to be surprised. I'm honored that you've listened to me.